Hi, I'm Kumar Bradford of the Buddhist Temple of San Diego. Um, and Kenchi Sensei asked me to do a Dharma talk today regarding activism, especially in consideration of the current events, including activities such as Black Lives Matter. Um, so I want to talk about that in a general way, uh, not to specifically emphasize or name any sort of political stances, but just to consider the idea of activism and also responsibility um, in the context of the principles and the 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 philosophies that we hold important at the Buddhist Temple of San Diego. So I'm probably going to look down and refer to some notes that I have, but I wanted to touch upon everything sort of in an order of 3 points. The 3 points I wanted to take a look at um, are outlined as spiritual activism, um, social activism, and lightly political activism. Um, I think oftentimes we see things in a compartmentalized way. We don't always realize that the interconnectedness and the interdependence that Kenji Sensei talks about is related to all things. In my own studies for my master's program, one of the very important phrases for looking at how to advocate for at-risk groups like people with disabilities is a term called intersectionality. And one of the understandings that Buddhism gives us is that everything is interconnected, everything is interdependent. Um, and if we even think about that in a way that we would think about electronics, such as systems with wires and plugs, it also means that we as people have different parts of identities that are different facets, that are different feedbacks that we produce and that we receive, depending on what part of our identity that we're talking about. So, to start, if we really go back, looking at the core of Buddhism, thinking about the life of Siddhartha Gautama, and we can imagine that his first identity that he initially embraced was that of someone with a lot of wealth and power and privilege in the monarchy in which he was born. And he was insulated from the experience of suffering, of pain, of poverty. And it took him realizing that there was a world outside that needed his efforts in understanding and achieving enlightenment. And that's one of the very first parts of spiritual activism that we have to be aware of. That oftentimes when we see activism on television or we see activism in our history books or in our communities, that the very first place that starts is spiritually. And from those teachings that have been passed down around the world for a very long time, we do know that one of the ways that is important for us is acknowledging certain ideas like the three poisons, making sure that we are not, that we're not consumed by greed, anger, and ignorance, or even in a more positive way, that we make sure that we're always giving, make sure that we're pursuing knowledge, uh, and make sure that we are feeling compassion um, in all aspects of our lives, in every identity that we may hold. Um, that we're giving when we're with family, that we're giving when we're with friends, that we're giving when we're with strangers, that we're learning when we're away from school, that we're learning when we're around things that are familiar, that we're learning when we're around things that are unfamiliar. Um, and that we have compassion, not only for the people that we know, but also for the people that we don't know, or the people that we thought we knew. When sometimes we get new information and our emotions may change. Um, and I that's those are very important teachings that were realized in a process of activism, a very, 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 very long time ago, of spiritual activism. And spirit can also be a way of thinking about your emotion or your feeling, and having almost like an awareness of your own psychology in order to have a larger and a bigger heart for other people. The next point is understanding the social activism part. Um, and I think a great example of how the lesson repeated itself and then therefore became something that changed society again, was when we think of how Shinran Shonin was able to go through his process. In some ways, once Buddhism was established, there were of course traditions. There was a theology. There was an institution based off of this knowledge that um, was you know um, transferred from ancient India to ancient Japan. Um, and we have to understand that the society that he was in was one that had feudalism, that had conflict, and it was very hard to kind of have the boundaries that we have today between, you know, what's political or what's social and what's spiritual, because they interacted all the time back then. Um, but it's very clear that within his own understanding, his own pursuit of enlightenment, Shinran made the same choice that Siddhartha Gautama made. And he experienced what everyday people experience by stepping away from his privilege and stepping away from the insulation of being a monastic individual, uh, only focused on studying and on teaching, um, to to walk away from that life and to experience what other people, everyday people, Bombu were experiencing at his time. Um, and that was a point of activism. When we take action for a bigger realization that goes beyond us, a sort of enlightenment, which is something that can only occur from having taken action in order to make a realization. And through Shinran Shonin, we see this as well. And when he did this, he essentially changed Japanese society altogether. He was able to bring the idea that we can reach enlightenment through our everyday and connect that to to so many people in Japan, making Jodo Shinshu one of the largest, if not the largest, uh, Buddhist philosophies that exist there today. Um, and very interesting enough, he had to do the same process that Siddhartha Gautama went through, and you know, looking past what was familiar and keeping core the denial of those three poisons, in order to expand his Sangha and to reach more people with what his realization was, and in order to be an activist in spreading his heart to other people. And I think lastly, what we can really look at when we think about our lives today and how we're just everyday people. We support our families, we live our lives, we go to work, we try to keep calm and maintain a clear mind in the face of a lot of these uncertainties coming from the medical system, coming from our economic systems. And I think probably the most dynamic thing that we've been seeing is that there are people who are acknowledging the political forces that exist, and they're pursuing a sort of activism in the more traditional sense that we're familiar with, that reaches back to the civil rights movements, that reaches back to Japanese Americans resisting the internment camps and surviving the internment camps. That sort of activism is what we're seeing. And however it can be scary and it can seem risky, but when we relate it back to the idea of Shinran Shonin, when we relate it back to the idea of Siddhartha Gautama, those two individuals took huge risk out of a choice of compassion, out of a choice of fighting greed, anger, and ignorance to make things better. And I think it's very important that when we look at activism today, when we consider getting involved in activism ourselves, that we look at those three principles. If we see someone who politically is focused on righting a wrong, if their tone, if their methodology is angry, then we have to consider, is that in line with what is spiritually okay for us? If we hear words that are said without knowledge and are said with ignorance, we have to consider, does that align with what our teachings are from the effective activism that Shinran Shonin and Siddhartha Gautama pursued? We also have to consider, are these things being said with greed or an ulterior motive? And then that lets us know that it's not the high quality activism that we're familiar with, that we've inherited in embracing and embodying the teachings of the Buddhist tradition. And I think it's important for us to know that although we may not be out in the streets, although we may not be protesting, that we are a part of this sort of spiritual and also social activism, and also very political activism, that the very effective leaders that we think back to Gandhi or we think back to Dr. Martin Luther King changed the world with their embracing of these sorts of philosophies. And that we have to make sure that we can distinguish and have confidence in the spiritual activism that we maintain as followers of Buddhism, as followers of Shinran Shonin, to understand that the ultimate activism is not one that is loud. It's not one that is angry. An activism that is not greedy. An activism that is not ignorant. And that for this tradition to last thousands of years through various countries lets us know that the true heart of activism exists with everything that we do now. and we can positively influence the actors that we have in society by making sure that we share the teachings that we've inherited, and make sure that people understand that the core of activism is in creating compassion and sharing, um, and in spreading knowledge. And I think for me, that's the core in everything that I see. Um, and it's always important for us to always keep those three things, even if we're watching the news, wondering what's going on. We have to be aware: is our response angry? Is our response greedy? Is our response informed, or is it ignorant? And that's how we can keep a mindful um, temperament during these hectic times. Thank you.